Hello, everybody. My name is Sean Michael Chick. I'm the author of The Battle of Petersburg and the book Dreams of Victory, P.G.T. Beauregard in the Civil War, which is going to be the subject of today's little talk, talking about the career of General Beauregard. Now, one of the first things that's going to stand out about Beauregard is, of course, his name, uh, which stands out compared to other generals of the Civil War. Not that we don't have guys with unusual names like States Rights Gist, but his name, Pierre, Gustave, Toutant, Beauregard, it's a very, very long name and, of course, unmistakably French. And that is because Beauregard is a product of a culture and a society that is very distinct from the rest of America. He is a product of Southeastern Louisiana's Creole culture. Now, that word Creole is a very controversial word and highly debated, and a lot of people give you different definitions. The definition that I go by, which so far everybody's pretty happy with because it covers a lot of bases, is that a Creole, for the purposes of Louisiana, because it means something different in the Caribbean, it means something different if you are a linguist, but for purposes of this part of Louisiana, it means someone whose ancestors came here and this is a colony. They maintain the colonial traditions of Louisiana, and almost all Creoles are of French, Spanish, and/or West African descent. Right, and they don't have to necessarily actually be one of those three. I'm just going to tell you 99.9% of them are one of those three ethnicities, and oftentimes a blend as well. So Beauregard is a product of this society, and Louisiana was founded by the French, owned by the Spanish, and then it gets bought by America. And so America was buying a territory with a culture where people were speaking French, where they had different cultural and especially political traditions. Now, Beauregard was not born when the colony, when Louisiana was a colony of Spain. He was born in 1818, so a few years after the War of 1812, after the Battle of New Orleans, which was very important to tying Louisiana closer to America in general. He was born to a wealthy family. His family had been in Louisiana colony practically from the beginning, so it's like roughly since the 1720s, with a long history of military service. Now, Beauregard's young child grows up on the plantation, which at that time was called Toutant Nord, not in New Orleans proper, south of New Orleans, in the town of St. Bernard in St. Bernard Parish. And these formative years, of course, very important because it's going to put him as part of this culture. It's very different from the rest of American culture. Creole culture being known for dueling, speaking French, and for having different race relations. I say that because slavery in Louisiana was different than slavery in the 13 colonies that rebelled against Britain. Those colonies being founded by the English and a little bit by the Dutch. The Louisiana colony, founded by the French, known by the Spanish, slavery here. Slaves were given rights because they are Catholic. And one of those was the ability to gain their freedom. So a lot of Creoles are free people of color, including many of Beauregard's associates. And he grows up on the plantation, and he didn't seem to take too much of an interest in actually ever wanting to own a plantation or anything like that. Took a very early interest, from what we know about him, in military. There's a story that he was in St. Louis Cathedral for a religious function. He heard a military band outside and ran out there to get them. There's another tale that for one of his birthdays, he was given a musket left behind by the British from the Battle of New Orleans. And instead of greeting all the well-wishers there for his birthday, he was too busy firing off the musket. So he does not take a big interest in plantation life. All right. He wants to have a military career, and this is really amplified when he's sent to school in New York. And the academy he attended there was run by two veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, one of whom had been personally given the Legion of Honor by Napoleon Bonaparte after the Battle of Austerlitz. These men regaled Beauregard with tales of Napoleon and the battles and the glory. And then Beauregard comes back home and reads all about Napoleon's life and declares that he definitely at that point wants a military career, which caused some consternation in his family, by the way, because the Creoles of Louisiana, many of them still did not like the Americans, including his grandfather on his mother's side. But regardless of that, his father is able to use his political connections to get Beauregard an appointment to West Point. Uh, attending West Point for Beauregard, it's kind of interesting because so many people would attend West Point. We get stories of them, like the tales of General of Ulysses Grant being good with horses, for instance. Jefferson Davis and the Eggnog Rebellion. We have almost no stories of Beauregard. Like his classmates, he seems to have made almost no friendships at West Point. So none of these other guys really had much to say about his time there. We only have one primary source that mentions a few things about his time at West Point, one of which apparently was him falling in love with one of Winfield Scott's daughters, which didn't really go anywhere. But once again, we only really have like one source for this. So his time at West Point, we don't know much, but I do know two things. One, he was not the teaching assistant for Robert Anderson, for the commander of Fort Sumter. That story is apocryphal. We do know that they knew each other in the Army and were friendly with each other, but they were never friends, and he did not serve as a teaching assistant. So get that myth out of the way. But more importantly for Beauregard, what we do know is that he excelled in school, graduates second from West Point, so he will become an engineer. And this is really one of the things that he has the most talent for. And Beauregard's a highly intelligent man, speaks multiple languages. Keep in mind, too, he didn't learn to speak English until he was 12 years old. He grew up in that Creole French society, but he learned to speak English fluently and only had a very slight French accent. So you have a man who knows multiple languages, who's going to be an inventor, and is a brilliant engineer. Even Jefferson Davis, who despised Beauregard all of his life, would always concede that he was a brilliant engineer. Now, Beauregard leaves West Point, has a series of assignments. We are used to tales of generals in the Civil War before, in their West Point, in the antebellum days, being given assignments they didn't like, such as, Grant being assigned to the Pacific Northwest. Robert E. Lee was being moved all around the country. Beauregard was really lucky. He'll spend a lot of his antebellum military career stationed in Louisiana. So right near his people, near friends and family. Well, he has an assign. He spends a lot of his time there, mostly working on coastal fortifications. And then the Mexican War starts. Now, at first, Beauregard is not sent to the front, so he does not take part in Zachary Taylor's battles. But he eventually was assigned to oversee the fortification of the Mexican port of Tampico. And then he joins Winfield Scott's engineering company, his engineering squad, which acted as scouts for Scott, if we don't plan things, as a kind of unofficial staff as well. And Scott, in many ways, was leaning on these West Point trained officers because Scott himself was not West Point trained, nor were his generals. So the Mexican War really is the first war, where West Point trained officers are going to have an effect. So Scott cultivated these men, and on the company with him, women like Gustave Smith, George McClellan, and most importantly for Beauregard, Robert E. Lee. And him and Lee worked together a lot during the war. Now, Beauregard himself wrote an account of this time in the Mexican-American War, which was then published with Beauregard in Mexico. That's the name of the published title. Highly recommended. It's a pretty good read. A lot of details in the campaign. Excellent source for any historians of the war. And a good look at Beauregard's personality, because what comes across from the book and from the records we have from the war is that Beauregard was a very talented officer, not only as an engineer, but also in formulating battle plans as well. But also, the account is very peevish. Beauregard is obsessed with getting his due and with actually giving other people his due as well. That's something to keep in mind. Beauregard is very, he gives a lot of praise to other officers. And we'll note where other officers did not receive the amount of praise as well, such as Zealous B. Tower at one point, and other such guys. So, but the thing is that Beauregard, he wants to give people credit for things, but he also wants what he believes is his due credit. And he oftentimes feels that Scott does not do that. And that is a running theme through the account. Regardless, in Mexico, Beauregard is excellent. Yeah. He helps place batteries for the siege of Veracruz. He helps find the flank attack that is going to win the Battle of Cerro Gordo, which many people consider to be the decisive battle of the war because the Mexican army never quite recovered from that one. From the the army was never quite as high quality as that afterwards, or of the same quality. Played an extremely important part in the victory at Contreras, so much so that his father renamed the plantation from Toutant Nord to Contreras to honor the victory. And then he plays probably his most famous role is going to be with Chapultepec. Because on the eve of the attack on Mexico City, Winfield Scott's debating which route to take. Most of the officers, including Robert E. Lee, want to attack Mexico City from the south. Beauregard was quiet, and he said that he was quiet during it because he was still upset about Veracruz, which is a bit cryptic of a statement, but he also says that he didn't want to give contrary advice to his brother officers, and that if they were proven wrong, they would be held against him. So he's doing this for very selfish reasons, I would say, peevish. But when asked to give his advice, he gives it to Scott honestly and says, you should attack Chapultepec because they're not going to see it coming. And Franklin Pierce, then who was a general in Scott's army, leading a brigade, he agrees with Beauregard. And then Scott eventually says, that's what we're going to do. And during the attack on Chapultepec, Beauregard is right there with the men. He helped rally troops. Sharpshooters have suppressed the Mexican forces. He's one of the first officers inside the fortress. He would later complain, though, that he was not the man to take down the Mexican flag because he was too busy making sure that some Mexican prisoners were not attacked by American soldiers. And then he plays a leading part in the storming of the gates of Mexico City itself and in telling Scott about the victory. So all told, when the war is over, Beauregard is easily one of the 3 or 4 officers, junior officers in the army, who has gained the highest reputation from this conflict, and was feted when he returned to New Orleans. So now he's seen as one of the Army's bright new stars, and he's loved by Winfield Scott. But Scott's favorite is Lee. And now Scott loves Beauregard. He has a high opinion of him, but Lee is Scott's favorite officer. Beauregard knows this, and Beauregard honestly felt that he deserved more credit than Lee. So this is going to be a running theme through his life, as a jealousy of Robert E. Lee. Now that's it. Beauregard, right afterwards, is going to have a tumultuous time between Mexico and the beginning of the Civil War. On the plus side, he's stationed in Louisiana. He does a good job overseeing coastal fortifications like Fort Jackson and St. Philip, plays an important part in setting up the Customs House, which still is on Canal Street to this day. And he supported the presidency of Franklin Pierce over Winfield Scott. And of course, Pierce did become president. And I would say Pierce did reward Beauregard by making sure he was appointed the Customs House thing. So this one little foray into politics did work out. But that also brings up something else about Beauregard. A kind of political incompetence. As talented as a general as he was, brilliant engineer as he was, and a skilled inventor, whenever he dipped his toes in politics, things always seemed to go wrong for him. 1852 should have been no different. I mean, think about it. His commanding general, the man who is his number one patron, is running for president and he doesn't support him. That's bold. He's lucky Scott didn't really hold it against him, from what we can tell. But other people would hold such political missteps against Beauregard, as things will turn out during the war. As just been noted, Beauregard did run for mayor of New Orleans in 1858, a very contentious election that almost resulted in mass violence in the streets here. That didn't happen, but it was a disaster of a campaign. Beauregard's wife, Laure, also died giving birth to their 3rd child, who was a daughter, who was then named Laure as well. Beauregard, by the way, had 2 sons before that, Rene and Henri. Rene Beauregard will command artillery units in the Civil War. But anyway, so Beauregard in 1860, he's going to marry his second wife, Caroline Delon, who is connected to powerful Creole families, much like his first wife, but also is related to Senator John Slidell. This is also one of the few times Beauregard showed some political skill because he was friends with Louisiana Senator Pierre Soule, but now he's married a woman who's associated with Slidell, Soule's rival senator. He's able to maintain good relations with both men, and they secure for him the appointment as superintendent of West Point. But this is on the eve. This is during 1860. This is on the eve of the Civil War. Beauregard shows political naivete during this time by thinking that secession is not going to happen. And he predicts that Breckinridge will become president. And I would say Beauregard was one of these men who he did not actively support secession. And in fact, he seems to not thought it would happen at all. But at the same time, he's not opposed to the doctrine of secession at all. So if it's going to happen, he'll be perfectly fine with it. So 1861, Beauregard leaves to become superintendent of West Point. At the same time, Louisiana secedes. Beauregard had made it clear that if Louisiana seceded, he would go to Louisiana. He would return home. And so he was fired as head of West Point after about 3 days in charge. He is still to this day the shortest tenured superintendent of West Point. Beauregard returns to Louisiana. He was not given command of the state forces because, remember, he'd not been actively supporting secession. Braxton Bragg did, so he was, and Braxton Bragg was also allied to Governor Moore, who was in charge of Louisiana, so he gets the position. Beauregard is very upset about that, refuses a position in the Louisiana State Forces as commander of artillery and engineers, and so joins the Orleans Guard Battalion, a unit made up of elite Creoles. And he joined them as a private. Now, of course, he's not going to serve as a private during the war. He's while he was only a captain, remember he was one of the rising stars of the army. And so Jefferson Davis asked Beauregard to come to Montgomery, Alabama, to advise them on what to do about Fort Sumter. Now, when he gets there to Montgomery, Beauregard immediately impresses Davis and Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker. Walker was in over his head. He was put in that position, a lot of people said, because Davis wanted to be his own Secretary of War. There's probably some truth in that, but also Walker was a fire eater, so Davis had to give something to those people. Walker immediately attaches onto Beauregard. At this point, Beauregard, for the first few months of the war, acts as an unofficial advisor to both Walker and Davis. Davis at this time also is very enamored with Beauregard, will end any letters he sends to him with my friend or your friend. So they decide to send Beauregard to Fort Sumter. Reason being is that he impressed both of them. Once again, he's an excellent engineer. Beauregard really got along with the elite of Charleston. He saw them as being very similar. They reminded him a lot of the Creole elite of Louisiana. And he actually said at one point, I see but little difference between them. So he's able to maneuver the domestic politics of Charleston very well. He does an excellent job training the troops, organizing them, setting up batteries in good positions. He also set up these floating batteries, which allowed some of the cannon that were out of range to be actually within range of Fort Sumter. And he handled his relations with Anderson, the commander at Fort Sumter, very well. Now, the bombardment itself is a bit of a foregone conclusion. I mean, while Fort Sumter wasn't heavily damaged, a fire was caused, and the fort was going to fall anyway because the garrison was just worn out from essentially being under siege for months. So what Anderson really was doing at Fort Sumter was just trying to, defend the flag. Beauregard handles Anderson's surrender very well. In fact, some people thought he was probably some Southern firebrands thought he was a bit too nice to Anderson. But at any rate, though, in the opening shots of the Civil War, Beauregard has handled himself once again very well. And for that reason, he is rewarded with command of the Confederacy's largest field army in Northern Virginia, which is placed around Manassas Junction. Now, Beauregard does a great job here, once again, organizing the troops, preparing them for battle, doing as much drill as he can, digging entrenchments as well. He's one of the first Civil War generals to really advocate digging entrenchments before any digging entrenchments whenever an army is stationary. All right. And Beauregard was trying to conceive of plans from which to attack Washington, D.C. These plans are rejected. This is going to become a running thing for him. Well, eventually Irvin McDowell's army leaves Washington to attack Manassas. By that time, they had already begun to transfer Joseph E. Johnston's army from the Shenandoah to Beauregard's position. And Bull Run really showed Beauregard in many ways his best and worst. Now, Beauregard came up with a series of plans to attack the Union Army that collapsed due to poor staff work. And it should be kept in mind at this point in the war, nobody has a good staff, so Beauregard is in no way special, and his staff will greatly improve as the conflict goes on. But at any rate, though, very poor staff work. And McDowell was able to march and hit the Confederate left flank. And when Beauregard finally realizes where the fight really is happening, where he needs to be, then he swings into action perfectly. Goes to the front line with Joseph E. Johnston, rallies troops, and that should always kept in mind. Beauregard was almost always very popular with his men. Partially, he was brave. He always well dressed, and he understood battlefield theatrics, the kind of things that would rally troops. He was excellent at that. So he's superb at Bull Run, rallying the men, getting them in position. He launches a series of counterattacks, the third of which finally breaks the Union into a rout. So Beauregard has won Bull Run and played a leading role in the victory. At that point, he is now the most famous general in the country. His images are being sold everywhere. Women across the South are naming their children after him, and he became one guy around here in New Orleans called him the Confederacy's rock star, its sex symbol, and there's some truth in that. The women would send him admiring letters all throughout the conflict. But no matter what, he is considered the Confederacy's premier military commander and hero. And yet, the post-Bull Run period is extremely frustrating. Joseph E. Johnston outranks him. Now, Johnston at Bull Run deferred to him because Beauregard knew knew the area and most of the troops had been under his command. He knew the terrain, he knew the area. But after that, Johnston's in charge. And when they set up the Confederacy's first full-ranked generals, Beauregard is fifth on the list. Ahead of him are Samuel Cooper, Albertson E. Johnston, Robert E. Lee, Joseph E. Johnston, in that order. And the plans Beauregard would send to Johnston and to Davis on how to attack the Union are turned down. Now, much has been made, many criticisms have been made of Beauregard in regards to his planning. I think some of those things are fair. What you understood is that Beauregard based his plans on formal military principles based on a deep knowledge of military history, in particular Napoleonic Wars, but not exclusively. And I actually don't think Beauregard's plans were that bad. He understood marching divided, fighting combined. And he also understood that the Confederacy was going to win a major decisive victory. They would have to concentrate their forces in one area. Now, where I would criticize Beauregard and where Davis correctly did was that Beauregard really wasn't taking into consideration logistics, and also that Davis understood he had to defend territory. He had a political thing that he did, and Beauregard was willing to sacrifice territory, to take troops from one region to reinforce another and sacrifice territory for decisive effect. I would also say Beauregard's other problem is that he never really developed a very strong cavalry force. And to win a decisive battle in this area, you need cavalry that can pursue your enemy. Beauregard never quite seemed to grasp that, from what I can tell. Or at least he didn't try to implement it. So that being said, Davis and Beauregard, they have different ideas of strategy. I'm sorry, one other thing I want to add about that. Beauregard, I think one of the other big problems is that, and this is actually my biggest critique of his plans, they seem to assume the enemy would not really react to him. They seem to almost assume the enemy would just do what he wanted them to do or even remain docile. I do think that's a major problem with this stuff. Anyway, all this leads to a series of squabbles, escalating tension between him and Davis. Whatever friendship they had eventually it's going to dissipate. By early 1862, they're definitely not friends. It should also be kept in mind that by that point, people who didn't like Davis were looking to Beauregard to replace Davis as president of the Confederacy at some point. So even though that wasn't what Beauregard was doing, Davis's political enemies are rallying to Beauregard. Now, early 1862, Confederacy suffers a defeat at Mill Springs, Kentucky. This causes a bit of a panic, and Davis proposes to send Beauregard out west. Now, this has been portrayed by some as him trying to get rid of a subordinate who was annoying, and it should be kept in mind, Beauregard being under Johnston was an awkward position. Beauregard felt that he had won Bull Run. It should be him in command. I think what Davis was thinking is, I can get rid of this. I can move this commander away who's not very happy right now, but he is popular. So if I send him out west, it can help rally the people, the Confederate cause. And he sent him to serve under Albert Sidney Johnston. Johnston is Davis's ideal of who a soldier is. If you said, if Johnston is not a general, then we have none. And he writes to Johnston that he's sending him Beauregard to help out. So this shows that Davis at this point may not like Beauregard personally, but still thinks he's talented. Well, Beauregard out west. Eventually, but not too long after he gets there, Fort Henry falls, and there's the fall of Fort Donelson. Johnston will send Beauregard to West Tennessee to oversee the concentration of Confederate troops around there. Beauregard's very important in getting Leonidas Polk to abandon Columbus, Kentucky, and oversees the concentration of forces in West Tennessee and northern Mississippi, in particular Corinth, Mississippi. Johnston's army escapes from Bowling Green, Kentucky, abandons Nashville, and then marches over to Corinth. Now they're concentrated there, and then just to the north, Grant has the Army of West Tennessee. That's what it was known as at the time. Later on, the Army of the Tennessee at Pittsburg Landing. And it'll be Beauregard that will advise Johnston to attack Grant in his camps. Now, we could do an entire presentation on what happens at Shiloh. This is, of course, one of the biggest, bloodiest battles of the Civil War, and is the turning point of Beauregard's life. Because going into this battle, he is the Confederacy's premier military hero. However, Beauregard's idea of attacking at Shiloh was that they would surprise the Federals. And he believed they could do this because they had driven in Grant's advanced pickets. Well, not pickets really, but his advanced outposts. They'd driven them in. Beauregard knew they were not entrenched. That's what the spies were telling him. So a lot of the locals in the area were passing on information. And so they believed that they could get the jump on him. But the thing is, Beauregard hoped to attack on April 4th. That very quickly got abandoned, so April 5th was chosen as the day. But that got delayed due to traffic jams. It was also a very rainy season, so the roads were in awful condition. And so Beauregard advises Johnston not to attack and says, there's no way that the Union doesn't know we're here. He said they'll be entrenched to the eyes. And Johnston overrules him and famously says, I would fight them if they were a million. And so on April 6th, the morning of April 6th, 1862, Beauregard once again tries to implore Johnston to retreat. Then the first shots of the battle are heard at Fraley Field, and the Battle of Shiloh is on. Now, during the battle, you have a reverse of Bull Run. Because at Bull Run, Beauregard was at the front, directing men, rallying troops, and Joseph E. Johnston had been in the rear, directing where the reserves would go. Well, that'll be the opposite here for Shiloh. Beauregard will be in the rear, directing where reserves and troops go, while Albert Sidney Johnston is at the front, and is at the front where Johnston dies in the early afternoon of the battle. Command passes to Beauregard. There isn't much of a lull in the battle, except towards the Confederate right, because that's where Johnston died. There's a bit of a lull there, but the Confederate center and left, the battle continues as if Johnston had never died. And is under Beauregard's command that the Confederates eventually smash the famous Hornet's Nest and thereby capture over 2,000 Union soldiers in one of, if not the only, double envelopment I know in the Civil War, one of the only double envelopments of the whole Civil War, and maybe the only one involving pure infantry forces. So the Confederates think they've won a smashing victory, and they're lining up to attack Grant's final position at Dill Branch, which is bristling with artillery. But the attack is called off. Now, at the time, not many people questioned that. The men were tired, low on ammunition, disorganized, the sun was setting, and Grant had a lot of cannons, and the terrain was very difficult. But after the battle, it would become a feature of the lost cause that Beauregard lost Shiloh because he did not launch that last attack at dusk. The belief being that all they had to do was strike Grant and it was over. Most contemporary historians of Shiloh do not believe so. I'm inclined, of course, to agree with them, although I say it has more to do with the time of day than anything else. The Confederates just don't have enough time before the sun sets to make any kind of a credible attack, especially considering how difficult the terrain is. That being said, the Confederates fall back, but they're still confident they're going to win on the next day, especially because it is on the night of April 6th that information arrives that Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio is not coming to reinforce Grant, that they're going towards northern Alabama. In reality, Buell is reinforcing Grant that night. And it's with those, plus the arrival of Lew Wallace's division and whatever troops they could throw together from the April 6th fight, that Grant and Buell attack on April 7th and drive Beauregard away. So Beauregard has lost the Battle of Shiloh. I would like to say one other thing about Shiloh in regards to Beauregard's generalship on the second day. In one regard, he made a giant mistake. Very early in the fighting on the second day, he ordered his men to counterattack the Union. And I think Beauregard just underestimated how many troops Grant. I think he thought Grant maybe had received a bit of reinforcements, Lew Wallace's division, but not much more than that. And I think this was a mistake because those counterattacks, that unravels the Confederate line. Numerous brigades go in and are shattered and do not reform from those counterattacks. And keeping in mind, too, the second day of Shiloh, Beauregard had 15,000 men on the fighting line. That was the estimate that his officers said. The same token, the Union only put 25,000 men out there. Maybe the Confederates could have held them off on the second day, at least long enough for them to retreat that night and instead of being driven from the field. That's possible. But those counterattacks essentially doomed it. That being said, once the Confederate lines start to collapse as the fighting goes on the second day of Shiloh, Beauregard is at his very best, rallying troops and ordering a series of local counterattacks to delay them, including one where he grabbed the flag of the Orleans Guard Battalion, that unit he had enlisted in way back in 1861, full of fellow Creoles. Well, he grabbed a flag and led them into an attack himself, and such heroics and theatrics worked at inspiring the men, and those counterattacks kept the Union at bay long enough for the Confederates to be able to retreat without too much hazard to themselves. Regardless, Shiloh was lost. And of course, over time, the battle is seen as being very important to the Confederacy's loss, especially because, Grant survived the battle. He came very close to getting removed from command afterwards, but he still won the battle, so he's able to keep his command. So Shiloh just grows as the war goes on, grows in people's minds. Davis is more immediately angry because Johnston died. This man he does not like is in command of the army, and he embarrassed him because the night of April 6th, Beauregard was so confident he had told Davis, "We have won a great victory." So the Confederate Congress thanked Beauregard. I mean, this is humiliating. and then Beauregard loses Corinth, Mississippi. Now, in many ways, this is one of his best campaigns. He was facing a very difficult situation. Now, in one regard, Beauregard did mess up in that when he tried to attack Henry Halleck. Henry Halleck, by the way, took command of the Union armies there. So he took command of the Army of the Tennessee, which they renamed it, the Army of the Ohio, and then the Army of the Mississippi. So Halleck was in charge of this large combined force, and Beauregard did try to counterattack, but he was relying on Earl Van Dorn to pull that off, and it didn't happen. But he held Corinth longer than he probably should have, and he oversaw a masterful retreat from Corinth south to Tupelo, Mississippi. The problem was he wasn't. The reports he was saying to Davis considered unsatisfactory. There were reports in the northern papers after Corinth that thousands of Confederates had been picked up and that the retreat had been a disaster, which was not true. It was simply inflated. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why John Pope becomes really popular at the time, is because this was portrayed as like some great victory that he had won. At the same time, here comes the bad one. Beauregard, his health shattered, and I'm shocked he held out as long as he did because his health was poor throughout early 1862. Well, he decides to take a medical leave and didn't ask for permission. Now, when I say he didn't ask for permission, keep this in mind, he hadn't actually left yet. He simply informed Davis that he was about to leave. And Davis jumped on that, removed him, and never forgave him. Every attempt to place Beauregard in command again of the Western Army, which would eventually become known as the Army of Tennessee, will be turned down by Davis, even despite the advice to do so by Lee. So, and at this point, Beauregard, not only because he lost Shiloh and then Corinth fell, he's removed by Davis. He will never again be the South's premier military hero, especially as Lee and Stonewall Jackson really take that mantle, because, shortly after that, they're going to, drive McClellan away from Richmond. Now, where was I? So, Beauregard, though, still a popular hero, and was eventually put in command in Charleston to defend the city. This, in many ways, is Beauregard's ideal position to be in, because this speaks to his talents as an engineer. Remember, he's already popular in Charleston as well. So he oversees the defense of the city, which is crucial in 1863 because the Union makes a major offensive to take the place. The best ships in the Union fleet, a lot of monitors are sent to assist in the capture. Major Union land forces are committed as well. So this is a major offensive. And Beauregard is able to thwart them. And there's numerous things he did. For one, he realized that plunging fire from cannons could actually take out monitors. That works. Fort Sumter not only deflects a Union attack, but one of the monitors sinks. His planned defense for Battery Wagner is superbly carried out. And in addition to that, what also helps too is that the Union command go after Charleston has a breakdown. General Gilmore and then Admiral Dahlgren do not like each other. So this also helps out. So Beauregard is able to successfully defend Charleston in 1863. This once again makes him a major hero to the Confederacy. Because I like to point out to people, think about this at the end of 1863. Everyone else has failed. Bragg lost Middle Tennessee and lost Chattanooga. Wins Chickamauga, but it was a horrifically bloody battle. And of course, the army's driven away from Missionary Ridge. Joseph E. Johnston failed to do much to save Vicksburg at all. And of course, John C. Pemberton surrendered the army at Vicksburg. Port Hudson fell. Protracted siege, many ways a Pyrrhic victory for the Union, but a victory nonetheless. And as for Robert E. Lee, while he did win Chancellorsville, he smashed at Gettysburg, and his encounters with Meade after Gettysburg in Northern Virginia, sure, there's no big battle, but what battles they do have are mostly Union victories. 1863 is a bad year for the Confederacy. And one of the only bright points is that they held Charleston. So by early 1864, Beauregard is again a very popular hero. And for that reason, under the advice of both Lee and Bragg, Davis gives Beauregard a major command, the command of the troops that are stationed in Southern Virginia and North Carolina. And that's important because those said troops, they're expecting the Union to launch an attack towards Richmond or somewhere along the coast, because the Union is concentrating troops in the Army of the James under Benjamin Butler. Butler, of course, will launch the Bermuda Hundred Campaign, which is the secondary offensive that is supporting Grant's main offensive in Virginia. By now, Grant is commander of the armies and is overseeing the Army of the Potomac, led by George Meade, as they descend towards Richmond. It should be noted that Butler's attack is not a diversion. It is a major military offensive, is the largest amphibious operation of the entire war. Over 30 or 35,000 troops being landed in a few days through several points in Virginia. Beauregard was a bit slow to react, but the Confederates were in general. Some of this was also because of his health. Also, the Union cavalry raid in the area caused a lot of havoc. But the Confederates in the area are able to hold off Butler in a series of skirmishes and small battles. Beauregard concentrates his forces and decides to attack Butler south of Richmond at Drury's Bluff. Now, around this time, there actually was a thawing of relations between Davis and Beauregard, as attested by both men, actually. But there's disagreement on the plan to attack Butler at Drury's Bluff. And Davis wanted, just put it succinctly, Davis wanted Beauregard to concentrate all of his forces to attack Butler in one area. Beauregard preferred to attack Butler with most of his forces, and then have one part move into Butler's rear and cut off his retreat. Beauregard didn't tell Davis that he went with his original plan, although that was because he was being pressured by the Secretary of War, James Seddon, to attack as early as possible, which meant revert to the old plan. Point is, the Battle of Drury's Bluff is not one of Beauregard's best tactically. They attack the Federals in several positions. The fact the Union does as poorly as to do at Drury's Bluff has more to do with the bungles of Butler, Gilmore, and William F. Smith, Smith and Gilmore being two corps commanders. And the attack on Butler's rear was a complete fiasco. However, the Federals do retreat. A victory is a victory. I'd say in some ways much more, just as important, is the battle that happens afterwards, is Ware Bottom Church. Beauregard launches a series of attacks to force Butler back further into the Bermuda Hundred area, and that is successful. These battles not only make sure that there's no more threat to Richmond, but probably more importantly, they mean that Beauregard can reinforce Lee with two divisions of infantry, which are going to be very important because, Lee is taking heavy losses, fighting those massive battles of Wilderness and Spotsylvania. And so he's going to need those men for Cold Harbor. And they arrive just in time for that battle and are crucial, I'd say, to the Confederate victory there. Well, after this, you got an awkward situation going on. Beauregard's continuing to give Davis plans. Davis rejects them. And then Beauregard starts to think that Grant might make for his next target Petersburg, city south of Richmond. And if Petersburg falls, Richmond falls. Richmond falls, war's over. There's a lot of debate amongst Confederate commanders. What is Grant going to do next? June 9th, the Federals actually make an attack on Petersburg. It's turned back. That really makes Beauregard think they're going for Petersburg. And that is what happens. June 13th, 1864, Army of the Potomac swings away from Cold Harbor towards the James River, starts to cross the James. By June 15th, they are attacking Petersburg. Once Beauregard has that confirmed, he rushes over what troops he can, and Beauregard himself arrives that night, and he'll oversee the defense of Petersburg. This is definitely his best battle as a commander. And once again, of course, rallying troops, giving them confidence, but more importantly, able to set up these good defensive positions. And And while it is a defensive battle, keeping in mind Beauregard was severely outnumbered the entire time. Now he's facing a Union army that's weakened from heavy losses and heat and all the rest, but still masterfully conducted defense of the city. And I'd say this is the big one. This is one of the most brilliant and risky decisions a commander ever made, tactical decisions a commander made in the Civil War, was that on the night towards the night of June 17th, 1864, the Federals launched an attack that pierced the lines. That was contained, but Beauregard knew that his lines were now in danger of being overrun. But he had already had a secondary backup position being set up on June 16th. But it's not ready yet. And also, he would have to withdraw there at night, and he does just that. He has the army make a retreat in the middle of the night to an unfinished backup position, which the men then had to get to work right away, digging and getting ready. The retreat is masterfully done. The Federals don't really detect it at all. No units get lost. Very few men, when the Federals do advance in the morning, they only pick up a few hundred stragglers and whatnot, which is amazing that he pulled off this gutsy tactical retreat in the middle of the night. And that final defensive position was perfectly chosen. The Federals will launch attacks on June 18th. They fail. That's actually where a lot of the worst losses of the battle take place, most famously the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. And it is actually that line that the Confederates are going to hold all the way until, April 2nd, 1865, when at least the outer line was overrun. So this is Beauregard's best victory of the war, superbly handled. And the problem is Davis hates him so much that he actually wanted to launch an investigation about why Beauregard had abandoned the Bermuda Hundred defenses during this time. So think about it. Davis wants to investigate a general who just won a major battle that made sure that the Confederacy is going to survive longer. That's how bad that's how deep this hatred goes by this point. Now, for the rest of the war, it's mostly Beauregard would not be very satisfied. He serves as Lee's second in command, position he doesn't really like too much. He does play a bit of a role in containing the crater because that was his part of the line that he oversaw, and he had set up a defensive plan in case something like that happened, in case a penetration happened. So he does play a part in that victory. But then he loses the Battle of Globe Tavern. Even though he inflicted heavy losses in the Union, ultimately they win the battle. And he was then made commander of the armies in the West. But he didn't have tactical command of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. So essentially what he was doing was overseeing logistics and grand strategy and giving people advice. And then given the thankless task of trying to stop William Tecumseh Sherman as he marched through southern Georgia and into South Carolina. His last act as Confederate general will be advising Jefferson Davis to give up the war after Lee surrendered. So Civil War is over. Beauregard assessment as a commander. He had more success. He had more success than any other independent major Confederate commander outside of Robert E. Lee. And I say that people might point to Stonewall Jackson, but Jackson commanded no more than a corps. Beauregard actually commanded full armies and departments. Although Jackson had success as well. But my point is that Beauregard was this successful independent commander, and he had real talents as a general, especially his use of entrenchments as an engineer and his use of battlefield theatrics and just being popular with the men and working well with subordinates. He was generally popular with the officers who served under him as well. But his weakness is he's very bad at politics. He very quickly made an enemy of Jefferson Davis. And while Davis was exceedingly petty in 1864 and 1865, I would say the original breach was Beauregard's fault. Davis kept giving him chances in 1861 to stop the feud that they were having. And you could say Davis maybe didn't handle Beauregard well, but at the same time, Beauregard became increasingly peevish, defensive, And he was a proud man who had a high opinion of himself, understandably. But that's the thing to keep in mind too. Just because you're the smartest man in the room doesn't mean you're going to be the easiest person to work with. And in many cases, that might be a detriment. And I think Beauregard's an example of that. He considered himself smarter than Davis. He probably was, but Davis was his superior, and he did not learn to work with him. Now, beyond as a general, a few notes on his life after the Civil War, because he did have a very interesting and controversial life afterwards. He returns to Louisiana. He's in New Orleans. He will serve as president of two different railroad companies. He'll be ousted from both of them for political reasons. Once again, outmaneuvered in politics. He notably was opposed to violence and Reconstruction and supported equal rights for freedmen. Now, that being said, why he did this was for a complicated battery of reasons. Keeping in mind, Beauregard was one of the first to advocate for the use of black soldiers during the Civil War. And he was not like he never owned a plantation. That doesn't mean that he was some kind of abolitionist. He most certainly was not. He hated abolitionists, but he was not a hardcore pro-slavery man. And remember, he came from a Creole culture where a lot of people were free people of color. Those included friends, and I would probably say even relatives of his as well. So this is not a man. So when it came to race relations after the war, he advocated something closer to equality and peace. He also believed that if the Democratic Party, because he's a hardcore Democrat, if they supported giving blacks a right to vote, that they could then use those votes against the Republicans. Because one thing's for certain, he really hates the Republican Party. But none of this really comes to fruition. His support for this led to open mockery, and I would call him a civil rights advocate, not an activist, because ultimately what Beauregard's main objective during Reconstruction is having a job, making money, and making enough money to leave to his family, which led to good things like his work with the railroads around here. Very, very important work, especially the railroad that people use today. Well, I call it a railroad, being the streetcar. He didn't introduce the streetcar. He introduced the prototype of the streetcar we have today, early prototype of it, but he did not introduce streetcar that we have. But that said, it also led him to make one other big mistake. Join the Louisiana lottery. He'd be the man to call out the numbers for who won this and that. And I mention that as a mistake because while Beauregard made good money on that, it ruined his reputation because it was just something that people did not think a Confederate general should be doing. And everybody knew that Beauregard wasn't corrupt. But the lottery was corrupt itself. And that meant that Beauregard, what their thought was, is that they're looking at this guy and they're thinking, is he dumb or is he just oblivious because he's being paid well? Either way, does not look good. And the Louisiana lottery did play a crucial role in, I would say, ruining his reputation. At the same time, while Beauregard had won battles like, Bull Run and Petersburg, he held on to Charleston, the defeated Shiloh hung over him to his dying day. You can look at old issues of Confederate veteran, and those issues, the refrain that Beauregard lost the Battle of Shiloh is all over the place. There's I even ran to one thing, was a lost cause questionnaire for students. I think it's from the 1920s, and it says, so how did Beauregard lose Shiloh? Not did he or didn't he, just how did he lose it, in particular by not attacking at dusk on April 6th. And so there we have it. We have a man who had led a controversial, full, and fascinating life. I do believe that he is more talented as a commander than most people give him credit for, and is somebody of great interest in the Civil War. That being said, I wouldn't call him a great commander. He definitely had his flaws, but I believe that he had a flaw that several other generals had. I believe William Rosecrans and George McClellan had a similar flaw. That is that despite all their considerable military talents, they never quite mastered the way that politics and the military are supposed to work together. Thank you very much.